Hello, it's the Great Canadian Bagel here with a brand new series, Hot Take Tuesday. This series will be on the second Tuesday of every month, where I will present a hot take backed up by my own data research. All sources will be in the description. Today's hot take: private gun ownership reduces crime. Gun control advocates often defend their positions with criteria such as if it could save just one life, or comparisons to gun deaths per capita to show their reforms work. Cherry-picking, dishonest use of statistics, and outright lies are heavily deployed to fortify their positions. Let's start back to front. Gun deaths per capita is the most irrelevant statistic ever used. To privilege one type of murder over another is not just dishonest, but lunacy. Nobody should care how someone was murdered. We should only care that they were murdered. To this end, it is an obvious and uncontroversial truism that having fewer guns means fewer guns are used to commit crimes. That is uncontested. All homicides, however, gun control has a negative effect. I'm going to show a series of graphs to illustrate the point. First, we have homicide rate by country versus guns per capita by country. Now, there's an asterisk here since I have excluded every single country with more than 10 homicides per capita in 2017, or the nearest year data is available, and both Yemen and the USA because they are massive outliers on civilian gun ownership, having both 50 and 300% the guns per capita of the next highest. Well, what do we see? Well, each civilian firearm per capita reduces the homicide rate by 0.07. So if the number of guns per capita was increased by 100, the homicide rate should drop by 7. Now, this only explains 7% of the data variance. Combined with the massive variance compared to slope, it's best to assume globally, there's no correlation between civilian firearm ownership and murder. For sake of transparency, if the USA and Yemen are included, it takes from no correlation to no correlation. Now, you may ask yourself, well, what if other variables like poverty and lawlessness are clouding the data? Shouldn't we use a more focused sample? To that I say absolutely. Well, let me introduce you to what I call the EU+. Asterisk here indicates I am including the UK, Iceland, Norway, and Switzerland, but excluding Latvia and Lithuania. First four are included because they are very similar countries who have some degree of law harmonization, and the latter two are excluded because they are massive outliers on homicide rate, having more than twice that of the next highest. To this, we see the magnitude of the effect minimized, but the confidence increased. So now, increasing civilian firearm ownership now explains 17% of the data variance, and every 100 guns per capita is attributed to a reduction of 2 in the homicide rate. Now you may say to yourself, well, Europe has a lot of gun control laws. Maybe this indicates that those laws are more that with those laws, more guns are beneficial. Well, let me introduce you to the US graphs. First, here we got homicide rate versus households with firearms. You would assume, if gun control advocates were right, more people having access to guns would be linked to more murders. Instead, we see absolutely no trend. 0% of the variance is explained by how many people live in households with firearms. And the slope is minuscule compared to the data variance. See here, data variance, huge. Slope small. Now, if we look at just the... well, you might say, but surely more people buying guns could increase homicides. Well, no. In fact, this graph shows that we have a huge correlation between selling more guns to a reduction in homicides. Every 10 million guns sold reduces that year's homicide rate by 1. This explains an astonishing 44% of the variance in each year's homicide rate. This is truly sharp correlation. And to be clear, for people looking at this graph, this data point here is the number of guns sold in a particular year versus that year's homicide rate. That's all these points. So this is not chronological at all. If we look at just the estimated stock of civilian firearms in the US, then we get a similar trend. For every 167 million guns owned by civilians, the homicide rate drops by 1, explaining nearly 40% of the variance in each year's homicides. Now, I think these last two are correlated. Shocking, I know. But either way you look at it, it seems to be a strong correlation in the US to more guns equals less murder. To further add to this growing picture, let's look at the homicide rate by US states versus gun control grade. The higher the grade, the stricter the gun control. They go A through F, which I have converted to a 4.0 scale. Now, at first glance, there seems to be a correlation between the grade and reducing the homicide rate. But the gun control grade only explains 4% of the criteria, and the overall variance is astronomically larger compared to the slope of the graph. And specifically, we can see a few things that really show that this has no statistical value. At A- grade, we have above 8. At a C grade, we have above 8. At F grade, we have above 11, but also around 8. At a C grade, we have below 2. Or at F grade, sorry, we have below 2. At a C grade, we have below 2. And at an A- grade, we have 2. There is no obvious or clear trend here, even more so than just normally pointing out the variance is large. If you pruned the sample, you would actually get no trend. This is just not having any pruning or outliers removed. In reality, this guy up here probably should be removed as an outlier. I think this is Louisiana. But for sake of disclosure, I did not move anybody in the sample. Now, let's look at a specific comparison between some core Anglo countries who implemented gun control laws in the period of study, 1990 to 2018. Waha, we get this graph. So, first thing to note, the US had a federal assault weapons ban in 1994, as seen here. Some argue it reduced homicides, and point to the 1990 trend in the US where homicides fell by 3.3 in 5 years. Here, we're about 8.8. By the time we get to here, we're about 5.5. If the ban worked, as soon as the ban expired in 2004, we would expect to see an increase in homicides, if not an entire reversal. However, there was not a corresponding increase. Instead, over the next 5 years, homicides fell another 0.5 after having been stagnant since 1999. See here, stagnant, other than this one weird outlier year, stagnant. The ban's overturned, ban expires. It technically goes up a little bit, but then it goes down and it stays down. And it's now forever below this number, even though it's from 1999 to 2008 or 2007. It is stagnant. It is flat, more or less. But after 2008, it has decreased and it is now stayed lower with the ban expired. Second item, we will flash over to a more focused graph here. Australia's banning confiscation in 1996, as seen here, Australia in blue. First, note that the US homicide rate dropped 1.7 from 1996 to 2004, or about 23%. Australia here, to 2002, not 2004. Australia here, we can see, albeit a bit crowded, dropped from 1.96 in 1996 to about 1.87 in 2002. Right here. Effectively negligible. From 2002 to 2018, the Australian homicide rate drops most years, totaling a decrease from 1.87 to 0.89. During that time, Australian civilian firearms has also recovered from the mass confiscation, indicating the seizure of the private firearms had no impact. And it's also worth noting that any other effects of the law clearly have no impact, because if it takes 8 years for the law to do anything, well, the law didn't do anything. Laws should have an immediate effect unless there's no enforcement, and I've not heard anyone argue Australia didn't have enforcement following the law. Now, third item, Canada, as shown here, amended the Firearms Act in 1995, added things like licensing and banning various things. Where homicides, the homicide rate was 2.01, as seen here. By 2002, the homicide rate had moved to 1.88, about right here. And in fact, to 2018, the homicide rate has only fallen to 1.76. It's pretty clear that the 1995 amendments clearly didn't do anything, because in 23 years, the total homicide rate only fell 12%, compared to the USA's 39% reduction in the same time period, where in general terms, gun control has been relaxing in the US, and it has been tightening in Canada. Fourth item, the UK in 1996, as also superimposed here on the Australia line, they're right here in yellow. There was a ban introduced following the Dunblane mass shooting. Homicides were at a low of 1.45, as seen here. By 2002, as seen here, that's 2001. Nah, no matter. I have the number written down here, so we're just rolling with it. 2001, the numbers had increased to 1.63, and it would peak in 2002. I'm ignoring this peak because there's a couple unrelated reasons why this peak is high, mostly reporting murders being attributed here that happened previously, but that's not relevant. After which, there was a significant increase in policing in the early 2000s, and the homicide rate started going down. So under the hypothesis of gun control advocates, we have to assume this ban saw a negative 12% decrease in homicides. A negative 12% decrease in homicides. A negative 12% decrease in homicides by their own metrics. By 2018, homicides had reduced by 17% from their 1996 levels, seen here, which is once again lower than the US reduction in the same time period. So you can at best conclude the gun control didn't work, and at worst concluded it increased homicides in the United Kingdom. Under no combination of gun-related variables and total homicide rate is there a positive correlation between guns and homicide. Gun control doesn't save lives. In fact, graph 2, 4, and 5 all indicate a negative correlation between civilian firearms and homicide. What the data tells us is that not only does gun control not save a single life, but it's vastly more likely to be killing people. The philosophical arguments are entirely unnecessary. The data speaks for itself. Civilian firearm ownership saves lives. If you're not willing to entertain that, then at very least, it's statistically certain civilian firearm ownership does not increase the homicide rate. So at best, gun control is irrelevant, and at worst, actively harmful. If you enjoyed the video, do all the lovely YouTube things like share, subscribe, comment below, ring that bell. By all means, I love every comment you have on these kind of things. Let me know. And that, I will see you next time.